Hello and welcome to APTN National News Weekend. I'm Daryl Stranger. A new report examining allegations of systemic racism and other forms of oppression at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights was released earlier this week. The report follows several accounts from former and current employees claiming the museum failed to protect them from racism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination. Brittany Hobson has more.
As board chair, I apologize to anyone who has been offended by the practices at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights.
A scathing review into the workplace culture at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights has determined racism is pervasive and systemic within the institution. Interim CEO Pauline Rafferty accepts the report's findings.
It's saddening, it's troubling, it's upsetting. But I really believe that it has also identified the issues and gives us a huge opportunity now, in a transparent way, to make the changes that we need to make.
In June, several former and current employees took to social media with allegations of racism, sexism, and homophobia. An Instagram account called CMHR Stop Lying was created after the museum made a post supporting the Black Lives Movement. The museum called for an external review shortly after. Laurel Harris, a Winnipeg lawyer, was in charge of it.
There are folks who've had some difficult experiences.
Harris interviewed 25 current and former employees. The report found Black, Indigenous, and people of color were often passed over for promotion in favor of white candidates, as well as complaints of racism from BIPOC employees were often overlooked.
Systemic racism is a real thing in Canada. It permeates all of our major institutions. And the work of undoing racism requires policy change. It requires changes in practice, but it also requires introspection on the part of individual Canadians.
The museum also admitted exhibits containing LGBTQ content 7 times from 2015 to 2017 at the request of some religious schools. The new report outlines 44 recommendations to address the findings. Prior to the report's release, the museum's Board of Trustees created a new Diversity and Inclusion Committee. They are working to implement some of the recommendations immediately.
We need to make and do the hard work to make sure that our policies, our practices, our processes, all of those hiring practices are looked at, reviewed, and that we make the changes necessary to bring in a diverse workforce.
Rafferty says the museum has allocated $250,000 to put toward anti-racism, sexual harassment, and cultural training.
I believe together we can make the changes necessary, and I think with that change, I'm hoping the public will give us a chance.
The second phase of the review will be released at a later date. Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
We want to hear what you think about the report and its findings. Here's how to continue the conversation. Send your emails to news@aptn.ca. Find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptn news. Also, you can follow APTN News on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more Indigenous news. A recent survey shows 1 in 4 Quebecers feel the COVID-19 pandemic is a hoax. But for many, the threat is still very real. At least 2 First Nation communities in Quebec reported their first cases of COVID-19 in the last week. Other communities are doubling down in response. Lindsay Richardson explains.
The Innu Music and Cultural Festival, held annually in Sept-Îles, normally draws a considerable crowd. This year, performances were streamed online due to COVID-19 concerns. But addressing community members in a live stream this week, Chief Mike McKenzie confirmed a woman from another community came to the territory of Wahatmak-Maniutnam for Innu. She tested positive for the virus after making contact with at least 20 people attending watch parties. All those exposed are now ordered to self-isolate at home. I understand the situation requires sacrifices that aren't always easy, but it's the only way to get through this crisis, said McKenzie in a statement. It is our responsibility to keep our guards very high. The Innu community of Pessamit is also on watch. They've responded with new restrictions. Members can come and go, but non-members now have to request entry to the community 48 hours in advance. The woman in question is believed to be from Wimotashi, an Atikamekw community that until now has not seen a case of COVID-19. They maintain checkpoints at the community's borders even as the rest of Quebec opened up. Council is now asking for cooperation as they collaborate with public health in light of the news. Further south, the Mohawk community of Ganizadage has at least 5 confirmed cases of COVID-19. They're ramping up on-site testing due to an unexpected demand. Emergency officials say they're even impressed by the community's response.
Not only did you hear our message, you responded better than anyone could have ever hoped.
Ganawage near Montreal has not seen a case of COVID-19 in over a month, but they're opting to keep bars and gaming halls closed for the time being, even though Quebec now says it's allowing gatherings of up to 250 people.
Given what's happening around us, specifically a spike in 3-digit numbers of infections, given the occurrences in the other countries, the task force did not feel comfortable at this point moving ahead.
While Quebec braces for a second wave, many communities are experiencing their first. These recommendations remain. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and most importantly, keep your distance. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
It's time for a short break, but still ahead, entry into the Northwest Territories is under strict regulation. We'll show you what happens if people don't follow the rules in place after the break. Welcome back. First Nations children and families in the Yukon might be experiencing increased abuse, isolation, and neglect because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the pandemic began, social services have noticed a drop in the number of child welfare calls from schools and daycares, as well as from families seeking social supports. In response, the Yukon Council of First Nations and the Yukon government have launched a multimedia ad campaign. It will let children and families that have been left isolated by the COVID-19 pandemic know that there is help available.
We need to be as innovative as we possibly can to get the services out, and I'm really excited about this initiative. I think it gets us closer aligned and just reaches further into the communities to let them know that we have not forgotten about them, that we're still here, and we certainly are concerned and we want to support them.
Entry into the Northwest Territories is under strict regulation and has been since mid-March. Charlotte Warren-Jacobs gives us this update on who's allowed in, what paperwork they need, and what happens when they don't follow the rules.
If you want to come into the Northwest Territories, you better have a 2-week isolation plan ready. Border agents at this NWT Alberta check stop are here 24/7, and they'll ask for paperwork and IDs. Workers here document who's coming in and pass information to other government workers in charge of COVID-19 rule enforcement. Supply chain and essential workers are exempt from the 2-week self-isolation. But for the roughly 30 passenger vehicles that pass through here daily, around 12 are turned away if they don't have the proper approval. Dennis Marchiori, Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, says not everyone understands the rules.
There is a lot of information on various websites about COVID-19. Some of it's American, some of it's Canadian. Sometimes it's understanding the difference between coming from an international location and that you have to follow federal quarantine rules, which are more strict than our self-isolation.
For these southern travelers picking up 5 dogs from the north, the situation is frustrating. Normally, they would have gone to Yellowknife instead of waiting around, as an SPCA staff had to drive 7 hours to the border. As they waited around, another traveler breezed through the border, able to drive to Yellowknife SPCA for a horse.
And he was exempted to get the horse, and we weren't exempted to get the dog. So I think, and we had applied 3 months ago, so I think, even in terms of perhaps both are non-essential reasons, because it's approvals, but we at least went through a process. We presented a plan. We were very cognizant of people's concerns around the virus, and we presented a plan.
Since the spring, warnings and fines have been given out for those not following COVID-19 regulations. But some disagree with the rules. Michael Courtney is one of them. He walked across the gated BC and NWT border this June. RCMP kicked him out. He wasn't a resident, but was born in the NWT.
They drove me back to the border, and once they were gone, I told them, once you guys are gone, I'm coming back.
He walked over 700 kilometers, camping along the way, determined to see his family for the first time in 16 years.
I've already, been self-isolated. I've been quarantined on my own out in the bush for more than 20 days. I think I'm good. I haven't had any symptoms, and definitely after that long, you're not asymptomatic either.
After 4 days in Bechecal, RCMP and health officials came knocking.
The health official gave me two options. A, we're going to fine you and fine your sister's mother $10,000 for hosting you. Or B, you can come to the isolation center and avoid all the fines and just self-isolate for 2 weeks. So I said, yeah, okay, clear, cut, and simple, let's go. Just to put the rest of the community at ease.
Courtney says the next day, a different health officer showed up with a $1,725 fine. He's one of 8 to receive them. Since March 21st, more than 12,000 self-isolation plans have been submitted to the territorial government, with over 1,600 pending approval.
We provide stats that we give out warnings and written warnings. And then at some point in time, we have done enough education. And if someone completely violates the public health order and travels from the Northwest Territories against public health order, then it's a fine.
APTN News was told the government is looking at different ways to consider entry into the NWT and for COVID-19 testing. But for now, this border and these rules stay. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
Kids across the country are preparing to go back to school, and provinces have begun to release back-to-school plans. The plans vary between full-time classes, online schooling, and hybrid approaches. Jamie Pashagumscum takes a look at just what the school year is going to look like in Indigenous communities.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford wants kids back to school full-time. Nick Shaver is the Director of Education for the Mattawa Nations in Ontario. Each of the 9 communities are developing individual back-to-school plans. The Mattawa Nation has asked for $25 million in support.
If fully funded, it would be prepared for most eventualities that may come up. So if we have to go to an online learning environment, it would address those. If we had to go to a hybrid model, it would address those. And then if students were fully back in the school, it would address those concerns as well.
Kimberly Quinn is Director of School Operations of the Cree School Board in Quebec. She says the Cree Nation has no cases of COVID-19 kids will be returning to, but they are looking at other options should situations change.
So instead of maybe they have 1 day in school and 1 day virtual, we're looking at other spaces in the communities where the students can go, and working, let's say, with the cultural department and the Cree culture teachers, and again, in a safe way.
Quinn said masks will not be mandatory, and unless cases of COVID-19 appear in communities, students will be in school full-time with classes of no more than 15 students.
And keeping the group stable. That was the main aspect that our public health authority told us, was to keep our students in the same room as much as possible and only have the teacher changing.
While the Cree Nation will be returning to school this month, Mattawa schools are most likely looking to reopen in September. But a lot of teachers left when the pandemic hit.
Some schools' teachers did return several months later, or a month or so later, to kind of wrap things up. But most of the teaching staff that was not from the community did leave to go back to where they came from and didn't return to the community.
The Cree School Board's plan has 3 scenarios, depending on the level of risk to COVID-19, ranging from a full back-to-school plan to online learning in the case of an outbreak. In most cases, exactly what the school year will look like this year depends a lot on the possibilities of outbreaks or a second wave. Jamie Pashagumscum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
We have to take one more break, but coming up, how the Winnipeg Trails Association are incorporating Indigenous culture into downtown Winnipeg. Welcome back. Members of the Winnipeg Trails Association are getting their hands dirty this summer. And by doing so, they're incorporating Indigenous culture into downtown Winnipeg and creating safer streets for pedestrians and bikers. Michelle Karlenzig has more.
These young members of the Healing Trails Project are etching Cree and Ojibwe words into wood. The words will be on 10 cedar planters, which line a downtown Winnipeg street. The planters are also filled with vegetables and traditional herbs and medicines. The safety of the streets and bringing the neighborhood together is what Healing Trails Project is all about. Janelle Henry, project manager, explains the idea behind the project.
They're actually a COVID response to the open street so that there's more room for people to walk around, but they also double as a pathway for language revitalization and bringing like Cree and Ojibwe back into the landscape.
Executive Director Anders Swanson says because of the pandemic, it was important for people to be able to walk outside. The planters give everyone a bit of space.
So we started the Healing Trails program to kind of to address multiple things at the same time while turning that leadership over. And a pandemic hit. Suddenly people were needing to get outside really, really badly, needing to get healthy. So this actual project came out of, and you see it's working. Yeah. Right there, that's what this is about. So this street can sometimes be a drag strip, and there's people on here. We've known this for almost 2 decades now. We've been trying to fix it because people are out here with strollers and they're biking with their kids, and then somebody comes flying down in a car, and it ruins what this place could be.
The planters are also a way for people to learn about culture and to stay safe. Henry's focus is for healing the past, present, and future.
We all know that Indigenous people have experienced profound trauma on this land. And so psychologist Dr. Eduardo Duran says in order for healing to take place, it has to happen on the land where the trauma occurred. So there's lots of trauma here, and so by doing these types of programs, we're healing the land and healing the people by healing the collective trauma.
The boxes will be up until September 7th of this year, and Winnipeg Trails hopes to carry on the program next summer. Michelle Karlenzig, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
An academic in Edmonton is hoping to reunite some very special photos with an Inuit family and carvings with a regional cultural center. Elena McDougall has more.
So these are a couple of the little tiny figures. You can see how small they are.
Valerie Hennetuck and her husband purchased a lot at an auction that may be of interest to an Inuit family or cultural center in Labrador. The lot includes some personal photos.
The descendants of these individuals would presumably love to have these original photos. They're a little damaged, as I said. They're not in great condition, but they are the original photos from that time. And somebody would love to be able to identify their great-grandmother or those sort of things.
There are no names on the photos except for the name of John Golby, who Hennetuck believes was a Moravian missionary.
From my research, it seems he was based in Hopedale, up on the Labrador coast in Nunatsiavut, around 1905, 1906, somewhere in that range. But the photos on the back say, for example, this is a particularly beautiful one of this young woman, and it just says wedding dress on the back. So no indication of who she is or specifically when it might have been taken.
Hennetuck is hoping that whoever can identify the items will reach out.
It's important that artifacts not be divorced from their context, from where they belong and where they have meaning. Too many items, both text and artifacts, photos, were taken from community, and I think it's really important to connect back to community. And, you know, my husband and I had always hoped that as we collect things, eventually we do hope to donate them to appropriate places if we can find the right places for that in a modest way.
Anyone with information can reach out to Valerie Hennetuck on Facebook. Elena McDougall, APTN National News, Hamilton.
Canada's first Indigenous photographer captured the resilience of Métis and First Nations people during hard times. He traveled to many Indigenous communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan from the 1930s to the 1960s. Now, the work of James Brady can be viewed for the first time. Tamara Pimentel has the story.
The late James Brady, a Métis activist who served in the military, a driving force behind the creation of Métis settlements in Alberta in the 1930s. And he is only now being recognized for his photography.
In many ways, he's one of the first, if not the first, Indigenous photographer in Canada. And a lot has been written about his politics, but not much has been done about his actual photography. So curating this was really exciting for me. It's the first time that James Brady's photos are being exhibited in a gallery, in a museum space.
Brady snapped pictures for 30 years, a record of the Indigenous people he met on the way, and now they're on display to the public. The Glenbow Museum in Calgary has been collecting these photos for the past 30 years. Paul Cisekwasis of Beardy's and Okamesis First Nation in Saskatchewan is the curator of enclosing some snapshots.
This was at the time of, the pass system and residential schools were, at their height, and Métis rights settlements were still struggling to have their rights recognized. So there's so much struggle going on at this time. Yet his photos show a different reality. They show people hard at work, people laughing, people having fun. So I think it shows another side of Indigenous reality, which is despite the hardships and the hard times, you have humor is still there, kinship is still there, family is still there.
At age 59 in 1967, Brady disappeared during a trip to northern Saskatchewan. His remains were never found. It isn't known whether Brady ever considered these photographs to be a record, but Cisekwasis says that's just what they've become.
There's a chance to see snapshots of Indigenous life over the course of 4 decades by one individual who traveled to many communities. So I think that is a very unique and interesting perspective.
The work of James Brady can be seen at the Glenbow Museum or virtually on the website.
He was very personable on a different level, so there are a lot of stories of him in different communities. He was kind of a big name during his lifetime.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Calgary.
That's all we have on this edition of APTN National News Weekend. For more Indigenous news, you can visit our website at aptnnews.ca. I'm Daryl Stranger. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.